I've been a member of the Art Deco Society here in New York since 1981, I think. And I started by running their, I created their walking tour program. And I'm still doing walking tours for them here. It's, 35 or 36 years later. I became interested in it. I spent 20 years at the Landmarks Preservation Commission here in New York, and one of my first assignments was to write a landmarks report on the McGraw-Hill building, which is an Art Deco building by Raymond Hood. I didn't know what Art Deco was. I just knew that the building was interesting. So I learned a fair amount about it and got very interested in it. I came back from graduate school to New York in 1976. The phrase Art Deco had only been around for 10 years. It was coined in 1966. And in New York, I think it had only begun being used in the early 70s. I looked at these buildings, and if you saw my video of the skyscraper show, museum talk, I just knew them as 30s buildings. Didn't really know what else to call them. So since then, I have learned what to call them. And I've been involved with this ever since. Art Deco is a phenomenon. It's a phrase that's used to cover far too many things. It's just very, many countries, many decades. In New York, it's much more specific when it comes to architecture. It really is a style that evolved in a series of skyscrapers. 24, designed by a handful of architects who all knew each other. 4 of them met for lunch every Friday. This is all true. And it really became an American phenomenon, even though Art Deco is named for a show that happened in France, and you can trace French decorative arts, especially in the interior things that you're looking at, and decorative arts. In terms of buildings, it really became an American phenomenon, if only because the French didn't build skyscrapers, and we did. The influence of French decorative arts is certainly there, but also German Expressionism, the impact of New York's zoning resolution, innovations in materials, new metal alloys especially that could be used on the outside of buildings, skyscraper design going back to Louis Sullivan in mid-19th century Chicago. But all these things came together and fused into a style. And at a very particular moment in our history as a city. New York's an old city by North American standards. But this was when we really sort of emerged as a modern metropolis on the world stage. And suddenly this was the style. We'd been a Victorian city. Well, we stopped being a Victorian city and stopped thinking of ourselves as an offshoot of England. We really became something new. A writer in one of the tabloids of the day described the new era as one of, I think I can remember all 5 of those things. He said radio, tabloids, World Series, jazz, and skyscrapers. I think that's right. And it was a time of really mass growth in the city. The population was growing by the millions. We had massive immigration. And it would become really a very middle-class city, something that it's not quite so much anymore. And with mass buildings, large office buildings, large apartment houses, large movie theaters, and in the early part of the 1920s, it saw happened right after World War I, it really became a cultural movement. First it was, well, let's try to look like Europe. Let's drape European styles of our buildings. And by the end of this decade, it was really more, well, that's the past, let's look at the future, because this is the machine age. We are looking forward, not backward. What sense does it make? So one architect wrote, what sense does it make to be putting Italian Renaissance features on a building when we're using construction methods that the Italians in the Renaissance period couldn't have dreamed of? And we're sending, many would have said airplanes, now we would say rocket ships. We need a style that looks forward, not back. There was a machine age. Machine age was a phrase that you heard. There was a big show, I think it was the 27th of the Met, called the Machine Age, and this was really part of it. It's interesting also, the buildings that adopted this tended to be what we would think of now today as high-tech buildings. Chrysler automobiles. A tabloid newspaper is very much a 20th century phenomenon. The Radio Corporation of America, RCA. The Oxford University Press did not want an Art Deco building. So it really was symbolizing this whole new mechanized future. And it was the style of the day. New York had the first zoning resolution in the country in 1916, and mostly that's about dividing the city into zones. This is a residential zone, you can't build a glue factory there, that kind of thing. But there was also a lot of concern about the growing number of skyscrapers. There hadn't been much in the way of building regulations. There were safety regulations. So sorry about that. way of turning that down. There were safety regulations, fire regulations, things like that. But suddenly the skyscrapers were going up. 8 stories, 10 stories, 14 stories, 20 stories, 25 stories. And the early skyscrapers happened in the Wall Street district, which is sitting on streets that were laid out by the Dutch in the 1600s. So it's basically a medieval street pattern. We don't think about American cities as having medieval anything, but New York's financial district is on a medieval street pattern that the Dutch have been using for centuries before they got here. And when you have one-story houses, which is what the Dutch had, okay. I'm so sorry. There. I should take care of that. When you have one-story houses on Dutch streets, that's narrow streets, that's one thing. When you have 10, 20, 30-story buildings, suddenly sunlight is disappearing. And there are safety concerns. Where are all those people going to go if there's a fire? So the planning, the commission that was set up to look into zoning also looked into shaping building bulk and height. And they could have put in a height limit. Other cities have had. New York's never had one. Apparently we like height here. So instead they came up with the setbacks. And the idea is this: if you own a piece of property, you can start building right at the line where your property meets the sidewalk, and you can go up, but only to a certain point, which is defined in the law by formula based on the width of the street, the area of the lot, and a number for that particular part of town. And then the law defines a diagonal line. Right? Nobody builds on a diagonal, so what you get are the setbacks. Mm-hmm. Well, setbacks became a prominent part of the Deco style in skyscrapers. Okay. Not as written into the law. They're written into the law, they're pretty boring. But what architects were able to do with them, they started to think in terms not of lines, but of shapes, of masses, thinking in 3 dimensions. And they actually wrote about this. So it was very influential.